Devil May Cry 1 is a landmark title in the action game genre. It helped popularize a lot of the key concepts we see in many action games today, and has itself become a kind of cult classic. Revered but never really talked about in depth. Mostly it tends to just get swept under the rug by fans of the later games, and held as this janky but still perfect object of worship by those who have been in the series since its inception. So, is it worth all the hype? Should you pick up Devil May Cry 1? I'm Chucky Prophet, and today we'll be examining all that and more in my Devil May Cry 1 review.
Let's rock, baby.
Okay, let's begin by giving a brief overview of the story and characters. Dante is a devil hunter, and the son of the demon Sparda, a powerful demon who beat all of the lesser demons into line and created a long-lasting peace between humanity and demons. One night, a mysterious woman named Trish breaks into his devil hunting agency, challenging him to a fight, after which she tells him about a devil named Mundus. Mundus is an ancient enemy of Sparda, who plans to take over the human world through an ancient castle on Malay Island. There we go, that's the plot. Good guys go into bad guy's castle and beat the shit out of demons until they get to him. Nothing smart and nothing flashy. But plot has never really been the focus of Devil May Cry, and it isn't here. However, what Devil May Cry does trade on heavily is the likability and fun of its characters. So what about them? Well, they're fine? Devil May Cry 1 is often hailed as bringing about the lovable, sassy gremlin Dante we know and love today, something which Devil May Cry 2 supposedly ruined by making him too edgy. But honestly, Dante's first iteration is just weird. It's caught between trying to be a lovable, sassy gremlin and an edgy, the blood of demons flows within me kind of character. One of these in isolation wouldn't be so bad, but more often than not, he just has these odd tone shifts in the middle of a scene which come out of nowhere and just feel incredibly out of place. As for the other characters, well, Trish is completely devoid of a personality and barely shows up more than 3 or 4 times throughout the entire game, and yet the writers still desperately try and cram this really poor character arc in for her. More on that one later. Mundus himself is difficult to discuss without spoilers, so we'll avoid most of it, but he's serviceable and kinda fun in a surface level, mustache twirly kind of way. So in summary, the characters don't really work. So how's this game managed to maintain such a cult following in that case? Well, while the characters don't work, Devil May Cry 1's dialogue is legendary for its janky-ass quips.
Nature calls? It's in the back.
And even more laughable attempts at drama.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
It's genuinely one of the game's main draws in a so bad it's good kind of way. And it's definitely never boring in that sense, but if you're looking for more than that, Devil May Cry 1 really has nothing to give you. That's pretty much all I have to say about the game without spoiling it, story and character-wise, so as I am now going to step into spoiler territory, if you haven't played the game yet, and for whatever reason want to go ahead unspoiled, skip to this timestamp. Psst. Hey, are there no spoiler people gone? Okay, so what the fuck is this? And why is it taking itself completely seriously? You can't have Trish show up to a grand total of 4 scenes and then expect the player to feel something when she goes through a big character change like this. A betrayal which Dante ultimately puts right by saying, "You look like my mother, and my mother wouldn't do this, so stop." Yes, plot isn't a large focus in these games, but this just annoys me because it could have been at least serviceable. Instead, it just feels like a half-baked serious moment crammed into a game that otherwise isn't remotely serious at all. Trish in general doesn't make any sense. She's meant to be a homunculus created by Mundus to beat Dante by looking like his mother. But why? It's the only reason Dante ever even finds Mundus in the first place, and Dante is exclusively a threat to Mundus's plans. So this plot thread doesn't make any fucking sense. I get it's Devil May Cry, don't overthink it, but this just feels so fucking lazy and haphazardly thrown together, which is such a shame because later games in the series, while they definitely don't have the most complex plots, at least try and make it through with some interesting characters or themes intact. Devil May Cry 1 has none of that. The only plot aspect of this game that works on any level, tonally or structurally, is the story of Dante's fights with Nilo. Nilo, as I'm sure you're aware, is a corrupted version of Virgil, Dante's brother, that Mundus is taking control over. The side story and reveal of him being Dante's brother, while still tonally off from the rest of the story, is a neat reveal, and it's handled without any of that goofy dialogue, so it manages to keep at least an air of seriousness. While there's no overt setup to this payoff, he consistently feels like a significant and present threat, and is consistently presented as a dark mirror to Dante through cutscenes like this one. Not only that, but in game he actually mirrors your progression. In his first fight he only uses basic sword combos and some teleporting bullshit, but in the second fight, after you've unlocked Dante's fist weapon, the Ifrit, he begins using these close quarters melee punching combos which look eerily similar to yours, and using gameplay to present story in this way is actually very fitting for Devil May Cry. It fits really nicely as a method for a game that doesn't place heavy emphasis on story to inject some into areas that wouldn't otherwise work that well. So good job, Devil May Cry 1, nicely executed. However, it doesn't change the fact that every other character is kinda just boring. Dante is just a plank of wood that sometimes spouts a one-liner, and while he does genuinely have some moments of emotion, those are completely negated by how bad the dialogue is. Trish is an even plankier plank of wood that's supposed to be tied in with the game's core theme of what it means to be human, but a total lack of presence in the story means that when they do even attempt to dive deeper into her character, it just feels unearned and completely out of nowhere. Now yes, I know the game isn't meant to be taken fully seriously, but as I've said before, other games in the series handle the balance of dumb bullshit and actual story and themes far better. However, for an action game, what really comes first is gameplay. So how does that hold up? Now, while story and character building ain't this game's strong suit, that can very easily be forgiven if it's fun to play. I personally believe that almost any bad aspect of a game can be overlooked if the game itself at its core is fun. So how does DMC1 hold up, especially considering how much its sequels have improved on its formula? Pretty damn well, actually. The core point of Devil May Cry is to style on the armies of hell as hard as humanly possible, reject simply killing an enemy, embrace performing an intricate 330 move combo where they don't touch the ground for 10 minutes. That's the Devil May Cry way, baby. And while DMC1 won't exactly let you do that, it does have a surprising amount of depth for a seemingly simple hack and slash. You have two main weapons, each with fairly extensive movesets and even some hidden combos that can be discovered with enough experimentation. One is a lightning sword that emphasizes attack speed and range over damage, and the other is a pair of fire gauntlets that trade range and speed for sheer crushing power and knockback. While using these weapons, Dante also gets access to Devil Trigger, an empowered state which makes his attacks significantly more powerful, as well as giving him some passive healing. It only lasts for a limited time, and then Dante has to fill his meter back up again by dealing damage or taking damage in order to use it, basically encouraging the player to be selective with when they use it, especially on higher difficulties. This all is then supplemented with a progression system which allows Dante to spend the red orbs he gets from killing demons on upgrades and new moves for his weapons. These range from basic quality of life changes that really shouldn't be upgrades, like the double jump, which makes the game's many jumping puzzles significantly less miserable, to really fucking cool abilities like the ability to fly during Devil Trigger and shoot fireballs. This system is perfect for Devil May Cry, as it rewards a player the more they actively engage in the game's combat with extra tools to make that combat even more fun. Unfortunately though, in practice, the depth and fun of the combat often goes to waste because of two key problems. First, there's the controls. Devil May Cry 1 has a fixed camera, and this isn't by itself a problem because it's a product of the time, and can work really well in games like Resident Evil, where giving the player little to no control over the camera doubles down on any fear and tension, because they're trapped in their own character's perspective, and can only gain a very limited amount of information about the environment. But in an action game like Devil May Cry, a fixed camera severely holds you back by limiting your field of view and thereby limiting your options when it comes to dodging enemy attacks. The developers, it seems, tried to fix this problem by having the camera change relative to the player's position in fights as often as possible. However, this approach just creates two new problems, as now not only is your field of view limited, you can randomly get bamboozled by a sudden shift in where your camera is positioned mid-fight, which can really be hard to adjust to. These camera shifts also mess with your directional inputs, so as you're trying to do one combo, you can do entirely the wrong move, which can be extremely frustrating in tense situations. These directional inputs themselves can also be incredibly fiddly and hard to get right, as a slight mistake can result in completely the wrong move sometimes. These problems are then doubled down on by the infuriating way Devil May Cry 1's enemies and bosses are often designed. See, ideally a Devil May Cry enemy should challenge you to use your entire toolkit to defeat them as stylishly and creatively as possible, actively encouraging a wide range of strategies and combos that can be used to defeat them. However, the majority of Devil May Cry 1's roster are either hit sponges that just stand there and do nothing while you whack them, or gimmick fights. Gimmick enemies are enemy types that have one specific trait that requires a specific method to deal with, and usually can't be defeated in any other way, at least in bad iterations of that design philosophy. For instance, there's an enemy in DMC1 called Sin Scissors, a ghostly entity whose mask is its only hitbox, so all those combos you've been refining, useless. All the options the game has given you, less efficient than literally just standing still and shooting. This approach to enemy design is fine in other games, but its pitfalls become blatantly obvious in a game like Devil May Cry, as fighting these enemies completely drains any fun out of playing the game at a base level. And this philosophy is the rule, not the exception, leading not only to multiple palette swaps of this same enemy, but also the single worst designed mini-boss I think I've ever had to deal with, the Death Scissors. This stupid goat-headed freak locks you in a confined space with a single fixed camera angle, while phasing into walls regularly and doing this annoying ass spin move that's next to impossible to dodge through a combination of every issue I've already brought up. Surely the actual bosses are better though, right? Well, 4 out of 5 of them, no. While their movesets and actual concept are quite cool, each boss has a central gimmick which allows it to avoid taking damage, such as flying in the air or an armored shell that your hits bounce off. The problem with these though is that the fixed camera makes it very difficult to work around these features. You want to hit the boss between the gaps in its armor, but because of the way the camera is positioned, you often can't figure out where they are. And miss hits you really shouldn't. It feels very much like the developers had a strong concept in mind for these fights, but didn't think about how they would interact with the fundamental elements of the game itself. The one really standout experience among the enemy roster yet again is Nilo, a boss that mirrors the player's moveset and forces them to use creative solutions and learn his attacks in order to beat him. I love bosses like this. Bosses that provide you with a fair but difficult challenge that you can use every tool at your disposal to deal with. A boss that rewards your learning of his attack patterns and tells, rather than just learning how to abuse a specific gimmick until you can do it blindfolded, like the rest of the boss lineup. It's the key reason why, after playing this game like 7 to 8 times at this point, Nilo can still give me an honest challenge. On that point, the subject of the game's difficulty is actually a very interesting one. There are 3 main modes: normal, hard, and Dante Must Die. The first time you play it, normal is actually a decent challenge, or at least it was for me, mainly because you don't know how to properly deal with enemies and bosses yet. The game then escalates this challenge in hard mode by changing up enemy spawns as well as increasing the damage enemies and bosses do to you, and decreasing the damage you do to them in turn. Both of these modes can be very fun challenges until you realize one thing: Devil Trigger does an insane amount of damage, enough to trivialize most boss encounters if you use it right. This in turn creates one of my main criticisms of this game. Devil Trigger is way too busted, to the point where the game devolves from strategic action game to just whacking things until you get Devil Trigger and then instantly obliterating all your issues. This again isn't really fun, as it seemingly devalues any input you have as a player in favor of one mechanic. Dante Must Die then attempts to fix this, and in a unique way, by giving all basic enemies Devil Trigger, so that after a time delay they become significantly empowered. It also nerfs your ability to deal damage into the ground. But can you see what one problem with that approach might be? Yeah, it just doubles down on your reliance on Devil Trigger. It's the only way you can reliably deal damage to bosses in Dante Must Die, so fights just become more of a question of waiting until Devil Trigger is back so you can start playing the game again. Playing this way either forces you to give up outright or become so good at abusing the game's core systems that hard and normal difficulty don't hold any of their original challenge anymore, ruining the experience to some degree. So yeah, don't play on Dante Must Die, whatever you do. As for its level design, Devil May Cry began life as Resident Evil 4, which is old news at this point, but it is key to understanding the thought process that went into designing this game's levels and pacing. The large majority of DMC1's segmented missions are centered around going to a place to fetch X item and then placing X item in Y spot. The game presents this as if it's a kind of puzzle, but there's only ever one place to put an item at one time, so it's physically impossible to get confused. These levels may also attempt to include pieces of gameplay that aren't combat related, such as jumping puzzles, which are miserable with DMC1's style of fixed camera, and of course there's its oft-maligned underwater levels. These segments come out of nowhere, and are only relevant a grand total of 2 times, on top of being incredibly unwieldy and unfun to go through. These segments only feel like they made it into the game because they were created when Devil May Cry 1 was still RE4. There's even concept art for an underwater boss, which I'm so fucking glad never saw the light of day, purely because these mechanics suck that badly. It's pretty clear at this point that the devs had completed so much gameplay for RE4 that they weren't willing to just scrap it, which came at the cost of the game's levels feeling incredibly repetitive and boring, especially when compared with later entries. As for the experience of fully completing the game, while it's fun for Souls fan Unga men like me to throw myself at the hard thing and see how well it works out, the experience is kinda miserable. While plot important items are incredibly easy to find, the blue orbs you need to upgrade your health are crammed in some fucking ridiculous locations for no reason, which is incredibly annoying, especially considering you basically need a maxed out health bar to even consider attempting Dante Must Die. You also have to do a no revive run, which basically forces you to either beat the game in one go or to manually set yourself back to the beginning of each level, which, yeah, that's annoying. The game's secret missions are also kind of disappointing, as only the final one feels even remotely special or fun, and the rest revolve around either beating ridiculous amounts of hard enemies in confined spaces, or jumping around to get things, and doing these is also the only way to max out your health bar, because they reward you with blue orbs you can't get otherwise. So have fun with those if you decide to try this. Now let's discuss the game's visual elements. I won't discuss its graphics in any intense detail, mostly because I feel it's kind of a moot point in any review, as art direction is far more important. However, I would like to say that this game has held up visually quite well over the years. There's nothing really that I can say looks awful, except from Trisha's blank stare that pierces my very soul. Anyway, my main source of praise for this game is probably its incredibly solid art direction. However, while each part in and of itself works perfectly, they begin to clash when they're integrated together as one whole. Let me show you what I mean. First, there are the main 2 character designs. Dante's design is deceptively simple, and works perfectly to communicate his character. The first thing your eye is drawn to when looking at him is his long blood red coat, which has become so iconic and attached to him that he looks completely out of place when shown with anything else. It also communicates this immense sense of arrogance, as he's willing to go toe-to-toe with deadly demons in this seemingly incredibly unwieldy coat. But beneath that arrogance and recklessness, the prominent buckles underneath that coat imply a level of restraint and maturity underneath it all, an aspect of his character the game's story fails to explore properly. His next most prominent feature is his striking white hair, which at a glance, even if you don't know anything about Devil May Cry, implies that he's something more than human. Top it all off with his signature pistols and sword, which I don't have a tremendous amount to say about because they're just kinda cool, and there you have your perfect action hero, with all the character elements you need to make him work summed up in that design. Trisha's design also works perfectly within this light-hearted, dumb action movie kind of vibe Dante's design is going for. She's very much supposed to be the femme fatale with a dark secret who draws Dante into the game's plot, and her design perfectly communicates that idea. Her outfit is attractive, but maintains this sense of power that ensures you know she could easily kick your ass if she felt like it. And that crack down the front of her corset is not only a very subtle nod to her lightning powers, but also a cool hint at her nature, both as Dante's betrayer and a copy of another person. These designs are both very strong. There's a reason why especially Dante has become one of the most recognizable video game characters, but here's where the problems start. The main characters' designs work well within the tone of fun action romp, and while the game as a whole is trying to present itself as that, the area and enemy designs are completely dissonant with that tone in my opinion. Yet again, this is a problem generated by the game's previous life as RE4, as twisted and bloodied marionettes and mutated cackling monstrosities work far better within that game's tone than the light-hearted action game that Devil May Cry is trying to be. This problem isn't present in all of the enemy designs. For instance, the Blades and Frosts both track as terrifying Resident Evil enemies and cool opponents for Dante to stomp, but those that don't fit in stick out like a sore thumb. For instance, just look at this boss lineup. Cool Lava Spider. Yep, that tracks. Lightning Griffin. That works too, at least until you look closer and realize that it's actually 3 birds fused together, but we don't talk about that. Edgy Demon Knight. Absolutely. Blob on the floor that becomes an armored Tic Tac. Yeah, on second thought, that one's just objectively awful, but you see my point. That isn't to say Devil May Cry can't experiment with fucked up enemy designs, but they've got to at least feel consistent with the tone other designs in the game itself is trying to set, not like horror game monsters crammed into another game. The thing that really drives this dissonance between Dante's design and everything else home, though, is the environments. So much effort clearly went into creating this haunting and melancholic castle and castle grounds. Eerily long hallways coated in rust and bloodstains, grandiose coliseums, and even a cool-ass ghost ship are all brought to life with such genuine flair and attention to detail, with some minor aspects of world building even being accomplished by elements of the environment, like the 3-headed lion sigil you can see in several places around the castle, which seems to imply that Mundus didn't just choose this place for his resurrection at random, but that it was actually a place where people worshipped him at some point, which is a really fun detail. All of this brooding atmosphere and looming dread sure would work great in a Resident Evil game, but it just clashes with the tone of Dante's design and the game in general. My objective in coming back to the point about this originally being a Resident Evil game is not to disrespect any of the work that was put into these designs or environments, but to show how the drastic change in what the game was intended to be midway through the design process causes this deep dissonance between elements of the game that should work together to create one cohesive whole, and how that dissonance really negatively affects the game it's a part of. Dante sticks out like a sore thumb in this environment instead of feeling like he belongs there, and while it could certainly be argued that this contributes towards a greater purpose, like making Dante seem trapped and under Mundus' control, it doesn't eliminate how jarring this difference in tone can be. The place where this dissonance is most easily recognizable, though, is the game's soundtrack and sound design. Picture it. After the game's bombastic opening cutscene with blaring rock music and stylish visuals, you finally get into the castle, hyped to start your adventure, and then you hear this shit. This sound is perfect for a gloomy dive into a haunted castle, thick with mystery and tension. It's rendered completely out of place though when paired with this, a contrast that keeps coming up every time a genuinely pretty boppin' battle theme like this or this comes on, and then you go back to bong, bong, bong. It just pulls you right out of the game, on top of the bong 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 being far overused in comparison to literally every other song in the OST. So you just get so fucking sick of it after a while. Again, this isn't to discredit what is on the whole a pretty good soundtrack, but to show how even strong individual elements like these can go completely to waste if a game's overall vision is muddled. So after all that, do I consider Devil May Cry 1 a good game? The short answer is no. While I respect its position as a classic, and as the progenitor of a whole genre of games, which includes some of my favorite games period, it just has way too many core issues for me to recommend it fully as a must-play. The entire game is plagued by a lack of understanding of its own identity, refusing to be either a fun action romp or a tense and mysterious adventure, and ending up as neither. these issues are compounded by several core problems within the game's design, which squander any strong elements within its gameplay. I recognize this is probably upsetting to many people who consider it a classic, and I am very willing to have a discussion on that topic, but until that point I can only recommend the game to fans of the series who want to understand its origins. In that respect, it is very interesting, especially when compared to the later games which really perfect the formula like 3 and 5. However, if you're someone who's never played a Devil May Cry game before, I fully recommend starting with 3 and trying the series' stronger entries before coming back here. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this review I managed to cobble together. I hope none of my points came off as being too disjointed, and if they did, please feel free to bring that up in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.